Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of February of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupyansk frontline. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses were around 80 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 1 howitzer D-20. The Russians reported that they were attacking the 14th Mechanized Brigade and 92nd Mechanized Brigade all over the front line, starting from Dvorechna and ending on somewhere in Liman front line. If we take a look at the deployment map, we're going to see that 14th Mechanized Brigade is located in the vicinity of Kupyansk, and 92nd is located a little bit to the south and in pair with the 66th Mechanized Brigade. During the previous months, these two brigades, with support of Territory Defense Brigade, were making attempts of attack in direction of Svatova. But all their attempts were repulsed by the Russians, and during the previous days, the Russians started their own counter-offensive operation, and to tell the truth, they're pretty successful. So when talking about the Kupyansk front line, if you remember, a few days ago the Russians reported that they established control over Dvorechna, and they published a number of videos in the vicinity of Gryanivka and Dvorechna of retreated Ukrainian forces. So some sources are saying that town by the name of Gryanivka is in the gray zone, but some sources are saying that the Russians have already entered this town, and now the front line in this area goes along Oskol River. There is two important towns in the vicinity of Kupyansk, is Sinkovka and Liman I. The Russians are saying, and the Ukrainian sources confirms, that the Russians entered Liman I, this town, and now the front line goes between these two towns, Sinkovka and Liman I. Some sources are saying that Sinkovka is under Ukrainian control, and some sources are saying that this town is already in the gray zone. Yesterday, few Russian military experts reported that the Ukrainians, under heavy fire from the Russian side, took a decision not just to evacuate from Dvorechna, Gryanivka, from this bank of Oskol River. Furthermore, according to some Russian sources, military experts, the Ukrainians took a decision to step back from Dvorechna on the Ukrainian side on the west bank of Oskol River. And to tell the truth, I can understand these rumors or talks, or maybe this is some kind of a true, because if you take a look at this map, if we try to analyze the area between, let's say, Vovchansk, Veliki Burluk, Veliki Белый Колодец, and Dvorechna, and everything, the Ukrainian territory from the Russian border, let's say, till the road that connects Chuguyev and Kupyansk, this is the wastelands, useless part of Ukraine. And we understand that the population in this area is not so big. A lot of people were forced to evacuate from this area during the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. A lot of people evacuated during the first phase of special military operation. So there are not much people, and there are a lot of problems with logistics to support soldiers in this area. And the most important, the Ukrainians understand that they need to support this area with products. There are a lot of civilians. So I believe that the Ukrainians they understand that maybe from some perspective it is better to return this territory back to the Russians, because at least at this stage. So I'm not surprised that Ukrainians took a decision to step back from Dvorechna. The best solution for the Ukrainians at this phase of special operation to establish front line somewhere on this line on the north of Kupyansk. Like, there is a lot of barriers, river barriers, forest, and so on. From one side, they will be forced to short the front line. They will be able to move the brigades that are located on the north, police forces to the south, and to feel pretty safe, pretty comfortable on the under this line. But so now, when talking about Kupyansk front line, when talking about the Ukrainians and the Russians, there is the same situation on Ukrainian side as we saw, as used to be on the Russian side during the counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side. This is completely useless part of Ukraine, completely useless ground. Nobody still do need this area. The Ukrainians don't need this area. The Russians don't need this area. But you need to hold this area for many reasons. There are civilians, like when talking about the Ukrainians, it's like the territory of Ukraine and so on. But from strategic and tactical military perspective, this is completely useless part of Ukraine, and nobody need this area, but you need to keep this area. Of course, when talking about the Russians, and if we compare the needs of Russians and the needs of Ukrainians, the Russians need this territory, because if they are able to return control, they will be able to restore at least the railroad in this area, and they will be able to connect, let's say, Belgorod and Kupyansk, and let's say Starobelsk and Lysychansk. So from some kind of strategic perspective, in 1, in 2, and 3 years, when the Russians are able to fix and restore the bridges, the railroad in this area, of course, this is a very important part of Ukraine. But for now, during this active phase of clashes, it's completely useless part of Ukraine. And as I told you, the Ukrainians, better for them to establish very short front line right on the north from the railroad that connects Kupyansk and Chuguyev, somewhere here. And the Russians understand this. They understand that there are not much forces, that the front line has a lot of places where they're able to penetrate this area, where they're able to send the commandos and so on. So this is the weakest point, and I believe that this is the reason why the Russians took a decision. Whether they're planning to start offensive operation, they will start this operation from this area. Now we're moving to Liman front line. There are also a lot of changes on the ground. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 1 Akatsiya howitzer. Furthermore, there are very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Tarskoye. When talking about the Ukrainians, today was the first day in a row when the Ukrainians reported that they managed to repulse attack from the Russian side in the direction of Tarskoye. So that means that this map, this red territory, this territory that is under Russian control, is pretty correct information. So the Russians now is in the vicinity of Tarskoye, and the main thing they need to do during the next days or maybe weeks, I believe not weeks but days, they need to establish the front line along the river, along these lakes, and it's a very nice natural barrier. They will be able to short the front line. They will be able to split these parts. Some part they will be able to send in direction of Yampol, Liman, and the Serebryanka forest, and some forces they will be able to send to the north and to complete the clearing operation of the ground between Oskol and Zherebets river. Anyway, I have no doubt that the Russians during the next months will try, and they will return the bridgehead between Oskol and Zherebets river. And the main reason of that, there are a lot of reasons, of course. First of all is reputation, because the Russians were forced to step back, and as you remember, a lot of civilians were punished by the Ukrainian authorities for supporting of Russians and for working with them and so on. The next thing is that, if you remember, the Russians published lots of advertising, a lot of banners, a lot of, updates that the Russians are here forever. So that means they need to restore the reputation from some point of view. The second thing, as we discussed, to restore the railroad in this area. And I believe that the most important one is that if the Russians are able to establish the front line along Oskol river, they will be able to do something as they did in Kherson area. There is a river that highly unlikely the Ukrainians are able to cross. They have their positions, the Russians, on this bank of the river. They have very nice artillery support. They have a very nice drone support, and they're able to spot, to follow, to see, to catch the Ukrainians and to reduce them, but just using the artillery fire and with help of, I believe, small operational tactical groups that they can, very mobile, flexible group that they can send to this or that part of the bank of the river just to complete with the commandos that were able to cross the river. So the same thing the Russians are able to do on Liman Kupyansk front line. They will be able to short this front line, and they will be able to reduce the number of forces that they are keeping here right now. Because when talking about the Ukrainians, there are still a lot of Ukrainian forces between these two rivers, and there are still a lot of forces in Chuguyev. There is a Kharkiv not very far, so they're very flexible, mobile, and they're able to move reserves, endless number of reserves on this bank of the river, Oskol River. So by establishing the bridgehead, by establishing fortification position, I believe that the Russians will be able to reduce the number of forces on this bank of the river till 5-10,000, maybe till 10,000 soldiers. I believe this is enough with the nice fortifications. This number is enough to hold this area, and then they will be able to turn these forces to the south and to complete this story with Slaviansk-Kramatorsk. As you can see, furthermore, when talking about Liman front line today, we received very bad news, piece of news about the Ukrainian forces. When talking about, if you take a look at a deployment map, you're going to see that there is a 92nd Mechanized Brigade and 66th Mechanized Brigade. Furthermore, there is 113th Defense Brigade. According to this map, this brigade is deployed in the vicinity of Bakhmut, but the Russians are saying that some parts and battalions are deployed on Liman front line. When talking about, let's say, 130th, there is a 210th battalion in this area of that brigade, and 16th Mechanized Brigade, 1st battalion. So a lot of so these two brigades had a lot of losses during the previous days of clashes, and the Ukrainians and the Russians reported that the commanders of Ukrainian army were forced to move these parts of this brigade back. So that means that the Ukrainians became less powerful in this area, and so I believe that the Russians will increase the pressure, and I believe that within the next few days we're going to see more updates on this map and more movements from the Russian side. Now let's move to Bakhmut front line. I believe you've heard today that the Russians, as a result of very heavy clashes since January, the middle part of January, finally they established control over Krasnaya Gora. At least the Russians are saying this. I believe that within the next few days, tomorrow, maybe the day after, the Russians Ministry of Defense will confirm this information. They will include this town in their report, and that will be the final point in the story of Krasnaya Gora. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation pressure from Vuhledar frontline direction of Fyodorovka. This information was included in the report of Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Now, when talking about Bakhmut, the picture is not very good for the Ukrainians. The Western source map has been updated. Now they're still showing that a part of Krasnaya Gora remains under Ukrainian control. Maybe this is true, who knows, but the Russians are saying that they managed to establish 100% control over this town. And when talking about the current situation, according to the Russian sources, according to updates we received during the previous days, I believe that the real picture in Bakhmut, in the north of Bakhmut, is something like this. The Russians managed to cross the river, not the river, but MO3 road, this one, in this bridgehead, and they managed to establish some positions in this forest located on the south or west from this road, and the Russians entered Krasnaya Gora. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources are saying, and the Russians confirm this information, that Ukrainians these days are trying to redeploy their forces from Paraskolyevka in direction of Berkhovka and Dubovo-Vasilievka, but they can do this very fast. They're able to do this very slow because they are always under heavy fire. As you can see, it's already a cauldron. It's already tactical encirclement. It's not a cauldron, yes, a tactical encirclement, and all the ways is under fire. Some ways is under physical control of Russian commandos that are sending all the time as close as possible to this agglomeration, to the north agglomeration of Bakhmut, and so on. So I believe that within the next few days we are going to see the final confirmation of taking of the town by the name of Paraskovyevka, and I believe that somewhere in the middle of the next week we are going to see this picture on the front line, that the north part of Bakhmut is going to fall and the Russians will establish control over these two towns completely, Paraskovyevka and Krasnaya Gora. And after that, the Russians will have to take another two towns. It's Dubovo, Vasilievka, and Berkhovka, these two fortifications. And these days, the Ukrainians are completely concentrated in this area. They're moving everything they can just with one purpose, to establish temporary fortification, just with one purpose, to slow down the Russians as much as possible. These two towns, Berkhovka and Dubovo, Vasilievka, we can say that if you take a look at the entire map of Bakhmut, you're going to see that, yes, there are a lot of problems in Bakhmut, but they still can fight. They still can change the situation. Let's say some miracle is going to happen and the Ukrainians, let's say, are able to hold for another month, and sooner or later the Russians will burn all their reserves, all their Wagner forces, and at some certain point of time they will be forced to stop. And after that, the Ukrainians will be able to start counter-offensive operation with the Western weapon and so on. It's highly unlikely the Ukrainians are able to do this. But the thing is that at this configuration of the front line, they are still able to do this. And the thing is that they still have possibilities to supply and support Bakhmut with armored vehicles, with manpower, with ammo, with shell, with guns, with bullets, with everything. The Ukrainian garrison in this town needs to stop and to slow down the Russians. But if the Russians within the next week are able to take control over Berkhovka and Dubovo, Vasilievka, over these two towns, from starting this moment, the Ukrainians won't be able to do anything. They won't be able to break the situation back, and it will be complete disaster that the Ukrainians won't be able to change. So let's update this map just for better understanding what I'm talking about. So the Russians, if they move to Berkhovka along the brushes, along the river and lake barriers, along the railroad station, and along the north part of the railroad station Stupki, this one. So if the Russians are able to do this picture somewhere in the next week or in the 2 weeks, this is going to be a tactical encirclement. Furthermore, we know that the Russians these days are pushing the Ukrainians from the south, and I believe that by the time the Russians take control over Dubovo, Vasilievka, and Berkhovka, something tells me that by this moment the Russians will be able to establish control over Ivanovskaya, and to get this river, then these brushes, these forest lines, and this territory. So this is going to be tactical encirclement. The only question I have, whether the Russians are planning to cut this road by both side attack from the north to the south, from the south to the north, or they will try to keep this small tunnel for the Ukrainians, and they will, of course, if they will keep this tunnel, they will concentrate all their artillery fire, all their pots fire, man pots fire on this line, and they will try to reduce everything that from the Ukrainian side who uses this road in this or that direction. So this is the picture, this is the story. When talking about Bakhmut, the Ukrainians and the Russians are saying that there are around 10,000 soldiers inside of this town, but you need to understand that they're not in a very good mood, and they don't have willing to fight. They understand everything. Imagine yourself, just compared to soldiers, one of the soldiers who located, let's say, in Chasov Yar, and he can see this picture, but he can see this picture in front of his eyes. And let's say any soldier inside of Bakhmut thinks about the story around this town when he see that the Russians attack, when he can see this story not just in front of his eyes but all around the town. The Russians are pushing, so they don't want to fight. Believe me, they don't want to be encircled. There are a lot of people believe in Bakhmut who did not very good things with the Russian soldiers, and this also scares them. They don't want to be captured by the Russians. They understand everything. If the Russians are able to find some improvements of some torturing or something like this, I don't think that these guys are going to have a very nice destiny in the future. So that's why the soldiers, Ukrainians who these days located inside of Bakhmut, they feel themselves not very comfortable. Furthermore, as you know, when talking about the Ukrainian authorities, there is Zelensky camp and Zaluzhny camp. It's like the president and the head of the Ukrainian army. And according to some Russian sources, Zaluzhny started asking Zelensky to leave Bakhmut maybe a month or a month and a half ago. But the Zelensky are saying that nobody is going to retreat. The Ukrainians are going to fight for Bakhmut till the last Ukrainian, till the last second or minute. And when talking about Ukrainian military authorities, a lot of officers, a lot of commanders started supporting process of Zaluzhny in media, in social networks, and so on. So the situation is very critical, and battle for Bakhmut can change the entire picture on the Ukrainian front line. Because anyway, sooner or later, no matter Zelensky is going to step back from Bakhmut or is not going to step back, sooner or later somebody on the territory of Ukraine will start counting the losses and will start asking the question whether the price that Ukrainians paid for Bakhmut was the objectives or goals that Ukrainians were able to achieve by that action. So we'll see, and maybe this is going to be very interesting discussion. So as you can see, the Russians established control over Krasnaya Gora and they're pushing to the north in direction of Seversk, but these fortifications are still very powerful and the Russians are not so lucky or so fast as they're fast and aggressive in the vicinity of Bakhmut. Furthermore, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost, just imagine yourself, 250 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 7 artillery systems, 2 M777 howitzer, 1 M109 howitzer, 1 Akatsa, 1 Gyatsin. So I believe that such a big number, the Russians got this number, I believe, as a result of final push or final storm of Krasnaya Gora, when the Russians were able just to count the Ukrainian bodies in this town, and they're saying that there are a lot of people, a lot of dead bodies all over the town. So the situation is not very good in the north part of Bakhmut. When talking about Donetsk, there are like a stable situation. The front lines are not moving in this area, just artillery duels, and the Russians attacks the Ukrainians' artillery positions, the Ukrainians attack the Russians, so on. Now let's talk about Marinka. These days, almost every single day, the Russian published videos from the west side of Marinka, and to tell the truth, the videos every single building in the west part of Bakhmut is reduced to ruins. The Russians are saying that it's like moon picture. So there are a lot of dust because of the fact that the Russians destroyed almost every single building. It's like a moon picture on the west side of Marinka. And they continue saying that just wait a little bit, tomorrow, maybe today, maybe the day after tomorrow, they will take Marinka. And the thing is that why the Russians are able to take Marinka, because, as I told you, there are no buildings left in this area, and there are no just places where the Ukrainians are able to hide and to protect from artillery strikes that the Russians do almost every single second on the western part of Marinka. So anyway, the Russians sooner or later will be able to develop their movement and to get the outskirts of Georgievka. When talking about Vuhledar, as you can see, the Russian source map has been updated. The Russians reduced the territory under their control in the vicinity of Vuhledar. If you remember yesterday, according to this map, the Russians controlled the south part of this residential area, but now they're showing that they control just the south part, and I'm not even sure whether the buildings, there are few buildings in this area, but I don't think that this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, when talking about the western source map, their map is updated as well. As you can see, there were bridgehead on the west side of Vuhledar, and that showing us the movements of the Russians in the direction of Bogayavlenko with the purpose of cutting this road. But as you can see, now there is no such a bridgehead in this area, and that means that, as I understand, The Russians still publish some videos, some photos of artillery strikes and so on. But as I understand, the Russians were forced to step back. They were forced to step back, and maybe in a month or maybe within the next few weeks, or as soon as the Russians are able to take control over Marinka and maybe to develop some bridgehead in direction of Pobeda, Georgievka and Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka from the north, maybe at this moment the Russians will make another attempt to storm this area. But for now they return back. Of course, when talking about the progress, the Russians had a lot of losses. We saw a lot of video and photo confirmation, but there is also a result. First of all, the Russians established control over this residential area between Nikolaevskaya Pavlovka, so they have a bridgehead right in front of Vuhledar, and so maybe the next time they will be able to start development. Furthermore, if the Russians do have bridgehead on the in this area right in front of Vuhledar, and if they are able to establish some trenches and some nice fortifications that they can use to stay against the Ukrainian artillery system, HIMARS and tanks, then it's not a very bad result. Because from this perspective, the Russians have their eyes there, and they will target the Russian artillery, and sooner or later the entire Vuhledar will fall under Russian pressure of their artillery and tanks. So maybe this worth it. We'll see. I believe that within the next few weeks we're going to receive an answer for the real situation in Vuhledar and something like this. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Stab B in this area. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed another 2 ammo depot in this area. So there is also small but progress. When talking about Kherson area, as you can see, there are still very heavy artillery duels. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 1 Gvozdika howitzer, another Akatsia howitzer, and 1 Raider INTP Q-50. So they're just regular artillery duels. And that's it, nothing more. But there is another important update about Vuhledar I forgot to mention. First of all, the problem now, the Russians have another problem in this area. Maybe this is a problem, but maybe this is exactly what the Russians were planning to achieve by attack from Vuhledar, from Nikolskaya Pavlovka in direction of Vuhledar. If we take a look at the deployment map, you're going to see 2 important updates on the vicinity of Vuhledar. First of all, the Ukrainians deployed 2 artillery brigades, 55th Artillery Brigade and 15th Artillery Brigade in this area. And this is very important because the Russians forced the Ukrainians to move their artillery forces from other front lines in direction of Vuhledar. That means that at some port and some front lines there are no more artillery systems, that reserves with artillery, that Ukrainians have limited reserves with artillery, and I believe that they used maybe not the last one, but at least they are very close to the last reserves in artillery systems. And this is very important. We know that the Russians are trying to attack in Kremina, in Svatova, in Bakhmut, and of course from this perspective those forces in Kremina that these days are trying to storm in direction of Kupyansk and Liman, Wagner's who storming Bakhmut, I believe that now they're able, the pressure and the difficulties of their mission has been reduced a little bit by the fact that Ukrainians moved a lot of artillery systems to the south. Maybe that was the goal and the objectives of the Russians in this area. Who knows? But from this perspective, and maybe this is the reason why the Russians decided to step back, because they understood that with such support of artillery in Vuhledar, in the vicinity of Vuhledar, they have no chances to take this town under control. So that's why they took a decision to step back. Anyway, sooner or later we're going to see this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.